like to welcome you all here to the second of the International State Crime Initiative's seminar series that I'm going to hand over to Saad Kassim, who is the organiser of this excellent series, in just a moment. But I wanted to say something about the International State Crime Initiative. We're based in room 305 along the corridor, so if you ever want to call in, please do. We work, as you might expect, on crimes committed by states, but we're also very interested in working on resistance in its various forms to state criminality. We've got quite a number of researchers who work in our office on a whole range of subjects and countries. We particularly have an interest in Israel-Palestine, in Burma, Myanmar, in Tunisia, in Uzbekistan, in Turkey, Kenya, Colombia, Papua New Guinea. So if you have any interest in any of those countries or it relates to any of the work that you're doing, please do call in and see us. But for now, I'm going to hand over to Saad, who's going to introduce Naomi, our very special guest today, and I hope you enjoy the seminar. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Penny. And as Penny's mentioned, I'm a doctoral researcher here at the International State Crime Initiative. And I'm particularly delighted to welcome Naomi Colvin from the Courage Foundation, who's going to really talk to us about a whole range of timely topics today relating to human rights and whistleblowers. Naomi is a campaigner with the Courage Foundation, which is an international organization that supports those who risk life for liberty to make significant contributions to the historical record. She's worked on the Edward Snowden Transparency Toolkit, which is an archive, which is a searchable archive on whistleblowing and human rights. And she's going to also share with us some insights on whistleblowing and how whistleblowers courageously continue to redefine the contours of investigative journalism and the world of accountability in general. And hopefully we'll get some insights into the legal implications of some of these cases. So please help me in welcoming Naomi.
Thank you very much for inviting me here today. I'm slightly intimidated by the number of people that have turned up. I don't do these things very often. It is nice, though, actually, to have the invitation to be here and to actually take a step back from being really involved in the individual cases, that I need to think about things in the whole and how to present it to you and how to present, I think, some of the issues that I keep coming up against when we're talking about whistleblowers, because it's becoming increasingly obvious to me that the work I do at Courage and the work that Courage does in defending individual whistleblowers and truth tellers, we're also doing a lot of work on the rhetorical level to make sure that the boundaries of what we're talking about are adequate. Because I think, just as an overall comment, that over the past 5 years, and especially since Chelsea Manning's massive WikiLeaks disclosures, we've seen an increasing public acceptance of the importance of whistleblowers in the political process and the importance of whistleblowers in not only making the public aware of, but also facilitating challenge to human rights abuses. But I think the official reaction to that has not only been the persecution of individual whistleblowers like Chelsea Manning, which we're very aware of, but a determination to try and narrow the rhetorical scope of what the word whistleblower means. And so it's very deliberate that the Courage Foundation talks about helping whistleblowers and truth tellers. So, I'm going to start from the beginning here. I touched on some of this already. Like, why do we need to protect whistleblowers? Why do we care about this at all? I mean, they're courageous individuals, but it's got to be more than that, right? So, the first point is that whistleblowers and truth tellers make us aware of state crimes. Just yesterday, the Investigatory Powers Tribunal, which is the sort of internal tribunal in the UK which oversees complaints about the security services, it's really a particular, kind of a tame tribunal really, but it found against GCHQ for the third time. Basically finding that GCHQ and actually MI5, the intelligence agencies use a bulk personal data set, which are population level databases, like passport database and a database of where people are travelling. So whenever someone hands in their passport at the UK border, that database. That the use of those databases by the security services over the past 10 years was unlawful because it was unknown. So it was unlawful until it was avowed in the summer last year. And there's no way that legal challenge, which was brought by Privacy International, one of a series of very important legal challenges they've brought, that challenge and the others they've brought and the other findings against GCHQ would never ever have happened if Edward Snowden had not stepped forward with his revelations and and made and put many intelligence agency activities on the record. There's just no way that would have happened before. And by making the documents available, because previous whistleblowers may have talked about certain things, and you can look at people like Ron Wyden in the US Congress, who's always been pushing the boundaries of what's possible to say, coming out of the Senate Intelligence Committee, but without seeing the documents, it's the documents which enable legal action. So there you go. They make us aware of state crimes. I would include in that making us aware of state crimes on a systematic level. I think the range of information that Snowden brought forward speaks to that, maybe even more so. Chelsea Manning's disclosures about the Iraq and Afghan wars, which was a whole sequence of sort of daily dispatches from soldiers and intelligence officers, which is actually what Chelsea Manning's job was, which allows analysis on a large level, and actually, because human rights abuses aren't just particular incidents. Actually, be able to look at a history, a pattern, sort of a broad pattern of behaviour is very important. In many ways, Chelsea Manning's disclosures are still educating us today. The State Department cables, for an interesting exercise, you might spend a week looking at news reports that appear in the English language on foreign affairs, particularly in the New York Times or The Guardian or newspapers like that, and have a look at how many of them refer to the State Department cables as source material. It's really everywhere. It's part of the standard reference for journalists working on pretty much every international topic. I would say, like essential background. Just as a side note, I think that the scope of the State Department cables if you were going to look at something country by country and actually do a survey of US policy based on the State Department cables, I think that's actually quite an under-researched topic still. Verso published a book called The WikiLeaks Files last year, which made a start on that. I think, and there's some good advice there on using the State Department cables if that's something that interests you, but I just flagged that as an issue. So, moving on from awareness of state crimes, whistleblowers also make us aware of corporate abuses of human rights. One of the Courage Foundation's beneficiaries is Jeremy Hammond, who's currently serving 10 years in a US prison for, he was convicted of hacking into a private intelligence company called Strategic Forecasting, or Stratfor, and releasing information from there. And one of the things that came out from that was how this company was being hired by big corporate entities like Coca-Cola and whoever the successor of Union Carbide is, to spy on human rights activists and report back, with dubious efficacy maybe, but the fact they were doing it is clearly of public attention. Whistleblowers and truth tellers have also revealed practice that may fall short of human rights abuses, but clearly has massive public interest and is a real public policy import. So an example of this would be Antoine Deltour, who was convicted just this year of releasing information about tax agreements that the Luxembourg government had come to with big multinational companies, granting them advantageous terms. This is the LuxLeaks released by the ICIJ, one of a series of releases that organisation, which is sort of International Consortium of Investigative Journalists. That's what the ICIJ stands for. about tax evasion. So the one you might have heard of, the Panama Papers, which was, I think, the biggest one and the most recent one of those. So whistleblowers and truth tellers make us aware of a range of abuses, both by governments and private companies. I think, and that's often where most public accounts of why we should protect whistleblowers stop. I would say there's an important additional one, which is maybe the most important, and that is that increased knowledge about these kind of things is actually one of the best triggers or catalysts for social action that we have. And many of the disclosures I've mentioned already have directly done that. They've sparked real social and political action. I mean, obviously, Chelsea Manning's is in a class of her own. I mean, the State Department cables had a real and contributory impact to the Arab Spring and the wave of democratic protests which followed that during 2011. I mean, it's hard to think about impact on a more dramatic scale than that, in my opinion. But also, I mean, not earlier on, in the same field as Antoine Dutour, but earlier, tax disclosures and the actions of whistleblowers like Azita Mumbar, the HMRC whistleblower, directly inspired UK Uncut to start their activism in the UK. And there are just more and more examples of this. Ramsey Orta's video of the NYPD killing Eric Garner, has sparked off massive and valuable and important social action in the United States, and here now as well. And I mean, I think you can also look at, say, the videos of police brutality that were being shared by Bluetooth on phones in Egypt before the Arab Spring. I mean, it's just masses and masses and masses of instances like this. Disclosure of information and dispersal of information is a real trigger for social action. And I think ultimately, that's why we need to protect whistleblowers and truth tellers. And once you, and this, by the way, and of course, and this is the key why whistleblowers and truth tellers come under enormous state pressure, because that's the key thing. I think once you look at things this way, in terms of dispersal of information as a trigger for social action, you understand that there's a real interdependence between different players in the information dispersal chain. So from sources to couriers, maybe getting information from one point to another, the people who enable that, maybe by developing technology, from journalists, publishers, and the human rights defenders who act on that information. All of those are very important, and actually courage draws quite a broad we understand truth tellers and whistleblowers quite broadly, and this is one of the reasons. Once you understand this and you're looking at this way, this is one of the reasons why I think that trying to define the term whistleblower very narrowly to somebody who works in an organisation and maybe has internal channels to is actually quite pernicious and something that we should fight against rhetorically. Okay, so that's why whistleblowers are important, in my opinion. I think there's actually lots of agreement that whistleblowers are really important. Although, as I say, with the caveat that a lot of these moves take what I would think is an overly restrictive idea of what is a whistleblower. There's been significant development of principles on an international level, particularly since Chelsea Manning's disclosures. One of the most important ones is the Tashwani Principles, which I think are from 2013. That was an open society initiative development that has had a lot of international sign-up at the time and has been endorsed to a certain extent by the Council of Europe and by the European Parliament. And I think those are quite useful to look at, essentially because they talk about public interest offences and they talk about the value of information disclosed rather than looking at the process by which information came into the public realm. Having said that, very few countries actually live up to sort of the leading international principles on treating whistleblowers and disclosure. If you're interested in how different countries RAD, there's a group called Blueprint for Free Speech in Australia who will prepare an annual report on whistleblower protections in the G20, and they've just done their second one, which is quite interesting to look at. You tend to find with sort of analyses of whistleblower laws, there tends to be, by the nature, there tends to be a lot of focus on internal mechanisms for reporting and preventing employer retaliation against people who are making disclosures either internally or externally. And I'm not saying that these aren't important. I think they are important, and for a lot of people whose disclosures are not likely to become the subject of official retaliation by the state, but their employer, so at an important level but a lower level. Those are very valuable, and I think work towards improving those is very important. However, they are clearly never going to suffice for the most politicised cases. And I think there's a very strong argument for embedding whistleblower protections at an international level. Yesterday there was a launch of a new campaign to put a draft European Parliament directive on whistleblowing to try and get the European Commission to take action on it, which may or may not be successful, but it's good to keep raising the issue. Antoine Deltour, one of the LuxLeaks whistleblowers, spoke at that, and he put this case for why whistleblower rights need to be embedded at an international level, I think, very, very well. Antoine Deltour, as I said, released information about overly favourable tax agreements reached by the Luxembourg government with big multinational companies, and he was then prosecuted in Luxembourg under financial secrecy laws. And as he pointed out, what Luxembourg thinks is in its public interest is not necessarily in the public interest of other countries. In fact, it's definitely not in the public interest of other countries to see their tax revenue siphoned away, because Luxembourg made these agreements. So that's ultimately why you need to have whistleblower protection at the international level, in my opinion. So I want to return just briefly to what I've identified as one of these underlying issues, which is like, who do we define as a whistleblower, if that's all right. As I've said, I think we need to define this expansively. And again, post Chelsea Manning and post WikiLeaks, I think there's been an increasing acceptance, not just by the public, but also in the academic literature, that whistleblowing is actually quite important to good governance and public information, actually getting things to move, and is an important sort of escape valve. But there's clearly a tension between this idea of who is a whistleblower, who qualifies, what is it they do before their disclosures come out that makes them a whistleblower rather than something else, as opposed to looking at the value of the information that's released and looking at things post facto. So I would describe these as two approaches here. I hope I'm making sense. Like the who is a whistleblower approach, which I think is a bit inadequate, to be honest, versus the providing a public, making sure that everybody who faces repercussions is entitled to a public interest defence. And if you're interested in reading further on this, I think a good example of the former is a guy called Rahul Sagar, who's an academic at Princeton University, and he wrote a book called Secrets and Lies, which gives a very eloquent account of why whistleblowers are needed in the political process, and then goes on to define whistleblowing so incredibly narrowly it's really difficult to see how anyone could possibly qualify for it. And on the other side, someone like Yochai Benkler at Harvard University, who's written some really good stuff on public interest defences. So I don't want to slag Sagar off too much, because it's a really interesting book. But I do think that this focus on who is a whistleblower and the internal process you would need to go through first, which of course implicitly says that you would need to be someone who's working in an organisation to be a legitimate whistleblower, which I don't think is the case. I don't think this fits today's situation very well, as I'll go on to explain, but I don't think it fits the historical situation very well either. One of the most influential and important series of intelligence disclosures in the past 50 years was the COINTELPRO revelations about FBI action against civil rights and other activists in the United States in the late 60s. That directly resulted in the Church Commission, which instituted the system of intelligence oversight, which actually worked, which, as far as we can tell, worked quite well in the US before 9/11 and everything that followed afterwards, which is what Edward Snowden and the other recent NSA whistleblowers have been telling us about. And how did the world get to know about COINTELPRO? Was it somebody in the FBI who stepped forward and told us about it? No, it wasn't. It was a group of activists called the Citizens Commission to Investigate the FBI who broke into an FBI field office in Pennsylvania and stole files from the filing cabinets and sent them to journalists. So, like I said, this who is a whistleblower thing, I don't think it even fits the historical record, never mind what's happening now. And what is happening now? Come on. I'm sorry if I'm overrunning. So, what is happening now? One of the things I find, one of the points that we keep reiterating at the Courage Foundation is that hackers are whistleblowers too, right? An increasing number of journalistic sources, human rights defenders, publishers, journalists are people who are acting digitally. And if you look at, say, someone like Jeremy Hammond, or some of the sources of the ICIJ disclosures, possibly also, the ultimate source of the Panama Papers, but I don't think that's been quite established. There's a really fine line between hackers and whistleblowers, like disclosing information by getting into a system and taking it out, more like the COINTELPRO revelations. And actually, one of the ways I think you can tell that the two groups are very, are quite similar in their impact and collapsing into each other in definition, is that they're both treated incredibly harshly by the state, particularly in America. Like the war on whistleblowers in America is also a war on hackers. It's particularly angled towards people who are acting digitally, which is seen as being particularly threatening. Now, not the least of the disappointments of Obama's tenure as US president is that he has been responsible for more prosecutions under the Espionage Act than all of the presidents before him. The Espionage Act being this act that was brought in 1917. It's a dubious constitutional standing that essentially applies strict liability for disclosure of official information. It's the way it is increasingly being applied in the States takes it closer to something like the Official Secrets Act in this country. So not only has Obama overseen an unprecedented number of espionage prosecutions, it's seen the first Espionage Act conviction of a whistleblower, which was Chelsea Manning, who was serving a 35-year sentence. And we all hope that it's not actually going to be 35 years at the end of it. And there's clearly extraordinary retaliation against whistleblowers in the United States. I'm reminded of when Edward Snowden escaped to Moscow, and Obama made that statement of, I'm not going to scramble jets to catch, to chase some 29-year-old hacker. Pretty much a week later, the president of Peru was forced to land his plane in Austria, so they could search the plane and see if Edward Snowden was on it. And we know now that actually, there was a private plane waiting in Norway as well, just in case Snowden could be apprehended and then carted straight up to the US, rendition style. Duncan Campbell's written a couple of articles about that, if you would like to look that up. In the same way, I think that anonymous and online activism has provoked massive hysteria in the United States. At the time when Jeremy Hammond was arrested, he was described by the FBI as like the number one cyber target in the United States. It's just really disproportionate. And there was a lot of reports in the media, sourcing from quite senior US political sources, talking about fears about Anonymous shutting down the power grid and all of this kind of stuff. Various US documents at the time talk about WikiLeaks and Anonymous as agents of economic espionage. It was all, the rhetoric is very, very overblown. I'm just focusing on like the most serious US rhetoric here. There's a lot I can say about that, but I'm aware that maybe I'm running over a little bit. So what the Courage Foundation does is that the Courage Foundation grew out of the Edward Snowden Defence Fund. We've existed as an organisation for just over 2 years. We're essentially set up to fill this gap in provision for individuals who have brought information into the public domain, or facilitated really highlighting it and acting on it in the public domain, and who have predominantly acted digitally, because that's a very is a particularly urgent and politicised area, and an area that other organisations weren't covering. Maybe because of the political fallout. Who knows? So we currently have 7 beneficiaries, 7 individuals that we're assisting. There are some others who are not publicly known, and we all hope that they're not going to become publicly known. And 6 of the 7 individuals who we support publicly have been indicted in the United States. So I'll just run through the list of who we support, and then I'm aware I've been speaking for a long time, and you can ask me questions about any of these cases. So Edward Snowden was our first beneficiary. As Syed mentioned, we've developed the Snowden Document Search, which is a full database of the revelations published to date and the documents, and we've strived to provide the most complete set of the documents publicly available. We support Jeremy Harron, Barrett Brown, and Matt DeHart, all of whom are serving sentences in US prisons. So we cover their restitution payments. We make the public aware of when they are facing retaliation from prison, and all of these people are in and out of solitary confinement a lot. This is a big topic we can talk about. We manage European fundraising for Chelsea Manning, and again, as you may know, there's a big prison support issue there as well. The one beneficiary we have who hasn't been indicted in the United States is Emin Husseynov, an Azerbaijani human rights defender who was one of the foremost reporters of action against journalists in Azerbaijan. We gave him asylum support, and he around the time the European Games was happening, so I guess was that last summer, or was it summer before? But he, after spending about a year in the Swiss embassy in Baku, he was taken to Switzerland and now has asylum there. So it's a bit of a success story. And I've spent a lot of this year supporting British activist Larry Love, who is facing extradition to the United States. Although I've been speaking for a long time, I'm kind of impressed with myself, because I've gone for about however long I've been speaking without actually talking about Larry Love's case. And given that it's pretty much the only thing I can talk about at the moment, that's quite impressive too. If you'd like me to rattle on about that in the questions, I'd be more than happy. And that, I think, is where I'll leave it. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Naomi. You've left us with so much to think about and reflect upon, and I think what we'll do now is really try to interrogate a lot of these questions more deeply and open up the floor to questions. Yes, please.
First of all, thank you so much for that really fascinating talk as a second-year law student.
Okay.
It's all brilliant. This question's in relation to the definition of whistleblowers. So you mentioned the Cohen Tell case.
Yeah.
But it seems in that case, the activists was positive whistleblowing, if I make that distinction. They
Sure.
actively made an effort to get the files, and it seemed like they didn't really know what they were kind of going for, and it just seemed random. So is there a difference between, would you make a distinction between them and whistleblowers who kind of just stumble upon information who they think are in the public interest? Because if the former is included in the definition, then can that be seen as kind of encouraging, just everyone just breaking into the security offices? which may be, you know, needed, but
Yeah, I mean, there's a reason why we talk about whistleblowers and truth tellers, because I think certainly the reach of people who are doing things that I think are important and deserve to be protected is very wide. I mean, I think that these sort of prior analyses of did you go through this step and this step and this step before bringing information into the open? I mean, in some contexts, this may be valuable, and if you were drawing up a set of internal guidelines for how an organisation should deal with its disclosures, you may want to do that. But I think ultimately, if you're looking at protecting people, particularly in the legal sphere, from disproportionate repercussions for releasing information which is of significant public import, then you need to look into public interest defences, which so no matter how the information reached the public domain, is there a significant public interest in it having done so? And I think that's an approach which makes more sense to me overall, although I don't discount that then you might need a sort of prior approach in some situations.
thank you so much.
Sure. Oh,
Sorry.
Go ahead.
Just a quick question about the Courage Foundation itself. Is it an established or registered charity, or how do you get your funding? Because I understand you said you help certain individuals financially. So where does the funding come from?
Well, we don't help individuals directly financially, but we do run defence funds for all of our beneficiaries. And actually, the defence funds are pretty much self-supporting in that they're crowd-funded. Like most NGOs, we have a mix of different funding channels, although for kind of obvious reasons we have less recourse to government funds than other NGOs might do.
Thank you very much, Naomi. That was really fascinating. I mean, given the role that whistleblowers play for us in the study of state crime, I mean, increasingly, we advise our students to look through the cables, to really look at WikiLeaks in particular, because it's a vast resource and is very revealing about various forms of state criminality and state corporate criminality. But I was following on from the last question, really. It's about the Courage Foundation, and how do you make your selection of, or how do you decide to represent a particular whistleblower? I mean, Amnesty, for example, have prisoners of conscience, and there are many, many people in the world who would qualify as a prisoner of conscience.
Yes.
And equally, there are many, many people in the world who would qualify as whistleblowers. So how do you make that determination?
Okay, that's an interesting question which I could answer in a number of ways. So, first is in terms of where Courage focuses, as I've indicated, we were sort of founded to meet a particular gap in very, very politicised cases. So we tend to veer towards those and cases in which information has had an international impact. I mean, the assumption being that in national cases there might be national organisations who are better placed to step in than us, and we also have a bias towards people who have acted digitally, because that's the particular sort of policy problem that we were set up to solve. Beyond that, you can get yourself, as the Amnesty example is very interesting. I mean, back in the day when I was campaigning for Chelsea Manning, which was my first foray into activism generally, I saw firsthand how tricky the Amnesty decision-making is with in terms of who you name as a prisoner of conscience or not. And Amnesty, although they're very supportive towards Chelsea Manning these days, which is good, and I applaud them for that, have always resisted naming her as a prisoner of conscience, which I think is what you can get, in my opinion, on that. If you look at the institutional history of Amnesty, which I have cause to do after that actually, but I mean, part of this is they're a much bigger organisation than us, right? But they, at some point, they set down, in quite procedural terms, who they would deem as a prisoner of conscience, and set down set criteria for that. And that got them into a lot of problems in terms of their organisation and battles within the organisation. Courage is small enough that we can say that who becomes a beneficiary is basically in the gift of our trustees, and we talk about it and there's a decision about it. I would say that when we're approached or certainly when I'm approached, I talk about it. Even for those people who are not going to take on as beneficiaries, we try to help informally where we can, just dependent on the resources and time available. And I think it's very important for actually all campaigns, but particularly us to align with existing support campaigns for other people where they exist. Like for instance, someone like Russ Ulbricht, the guy who was prosecuted for allegedly running Silk Road. That doesn't really fit into Courage's criteria, but he was clearly targeted and treated incredibly disproportionately because what he did or allegedly did was done digitally, and the malpractice in that case is so extraordinary. You have a situation where DEA officers have been prosecuted for basically, while they were supposed to be investigating Silk Road, for embezzling significant amounts of money from it in Bitcoin. This is all coming up for appeal. It's a really interesting case, by the way.
Is that the Australian guy?
No. So he's American. So I mean, this is an example of a case where we speak to the campaign, and we'll happily speak out on aspects of this which are germane to us without being able to take them on as a beneficiary. Straightforward.
I think we had one question here.
Yeah, it sort of follows on from what you were just saying. I'm interested in the overlap or the distinction, I'm not quite sure which it is, between cybercrime and whistleblowing.
Yeah.
So perhaps you could talk a bit about that. I mean, the question, I suppose, is, are the motivations of the whistleblower relevant in deciding whether they're a whistleblower? If they were doing it for money on behalf of somebody else, for example, and put that information out into the public domain, would they be a whistleblower?
No, I mean, I think that someone who's doing something for financial gain would probably speak to any public interest defence of what they were doing, or lack of it. I can't quite think of an example where financial gain has come into it, but maybe I'm just not thinking hard enough. I think it's beyond doubt that not just sort of the ability to transport a lot of information digitally with ease, but also sort of the ethics of the internet has had a disproportionate impact on sort of official fears about people going out and disclosing information. If you think about someone like Aaron Swartz, who's an astonishingly talented young American computer, software developer and activist, and I think was identified by many as as a future political leader in the US. This is a long story actually, but he was subject to a US prosecution. Things that he had written, particularly this document which he was a co-writer of the Guerrilla Open Access Manifesto, which is a piece of writing about freedom of information on the internet. Might not actually have been totally accurate of his view, representative of his views at the time he was arrested, but he was really targeted and to a really sort of heavy-handed prosecution, and he ended up committing suicide in early 2013. So that's a particularly it's a particularly prominent and disturbing case of that. I think there is a sense of fear about it's something to do with the ethics of the internet as well as the mechanics of how information can be transferred. It's a strange one because it's not. It seems to be something quite particular to the United States, and we can speculate about why that is.
Yeah, everybody in this room is probably very sympathetic to whistleblowing, truth-telling. So it might be difficult for us to actually try and get on the other side.
Sure.
But do you think that there are any kinds of information that we should draw the line, or particular situations should draw the line and say, no, that should stay secret?
I do. I think there are particular kinds of information that should remain confidential. I think it's right that there is provision for certain kinds of information to remain confidential. That's kind of it's an argument that I feel a bit funny about making. Not because I don't think it's true, but because the line of where talk about this country, my God, the line of, we found out not so long ago that the FCO had been keeping hundreds of thousands of documents in a previously undisclosed facility in England, which included documents dating back to the Napoleonic War, which apparently were still too sensitive to be released. So, suddenly this country, I think the boundaries of where official secrecy is drawn, are just like completely bonkers at the moment. And I particularly, I haven't formulated this in any particularly systemic way, so forgive me, but my feeling on this issue is there are particular kinds of information that should be confidential, but they should be confidential for a stated particular amount of time. I don't think there is much information which, after a certain amount of time, is too sensitive to be released. I think that by defining time limits and defining quite restrictive time limits on confidentiality is probably the way forward. But it's not my specialist area.
Yes, I want to build on the previous question about the motivation of whistleblowing. And
Yeah.
I want to ask if you believe that if the motivation matters. So if it matters, can we put whistleblowing cases into the category of civil disobedience, for example, while we know that motivation matters?
Yeah, I think that civil disobedience is a good model for it in some ways. Although we do have the situation where again civil disobedience carried out digitally, and I think, for example, defacing a website and putting it in, and putting a political message on it is a good example of of civil disobedience. It's treated much more harshly when it's done digitally than when it happens in the physical world. I've been working on Lowry Love's case, and I'll try not to rattle on about this, but Lowry Love is being targeted with 3 separate extradition requests from the United States. Completely ridiculous. He's facing something like a maximum sentence of 99 years should he be extradited to the United States for allegedly being part of the online protests which followed the death of Aaron Swartz. So exactly this, putting up a message on a website. I find this completely, bamboozling in a number of ways, but just on the face of it, it is clearly not disproportionate in any sense. Not proportionate in any sense. Yeah.
I was wondering what kind of legal framework and protections you'd like to see for whistleblowers. So what you would you hope for?
So yeah, as I mentioned, I think the Tashwani principle, TSHWANE, principles are quite a good starting point to have a look at. One of the things which is distinctive about them, and they came, and there's a lot of organisations were involved in drawing those up. And as I said, they had some buy-in from the Council of Europe and the European Parliament, so it's not just. So they have some status. One of the important things about those is they don't draw an artificial distinction between information which governments say is classified and information which isn't, which is actually quite an important frontier that still needs to be crossed in most national laws. But I think that there is a definite need to provide national level protections for whistleblowers and standards that companies and public authorities should live up to. But as I said, ultimately, a certain amount of whistleblower protection is going to have to be set with, is going to have to be sorted out with standards set at the international level, purely because of this point that Antoine Deltour made, that Luxembourg's public interest is not actually the same as the general public interest. There are particular types of disclosures which touch on things that individual states hold very dear, become very politicised, and with the best will in the world, no national system is going to be adequate to dealing with those, in my opinion.
Any other questions? Okay. Well,
Thank you so much, Naomi.
Thank you.